SSH, is a cryptographic protocol that runs on port 22. It's commonly used for connecting operating network services securely over unsecured networks. It seems like a contradiction until you realize that SSH makes cryptographically secure connections where one is not normally present. So, SSH is used for remote login and command line execution. In the network world, we understand these connections pretty well. SSH applications are based on client-server architecture, but what about SSH in the IoT world? Well, in early 2022, Mandiant, now part of Google, found some malware using drop-bear SSH on IoT devices. What Mandiant found, dubbed Quiet Exit, used SSH on OT devices to create a backdoor into the enterprise systems themselves. This malware was looking for access to email, if not general access, so that they could drop other tools on the victim's network. This is the story of how OT devices within your organization can be used to exfiltrate data and what you can do about it. I'm Robert Vamosi. This is Error Code.
I'm Sonu Shankar, Vice President of Product at Phosphorus Cybersecurity. We are a security company HQ'd out of Nashville, Tennessee. Phosphorus, we are focused on XIoT remediation. And what I mean by XIoT is we refer to it as the extended Internet of Things. So essentially any connected device ranging from your traditional IoT devices in the enterprise, cameras, printers, phones, badge readers, elevator control systems, door controllers, those types of devices, to medical devices or IOMT, such as infusion pumps, patient health monitors, and also IIoT and OT more in the industrial and manufacturing space. So we focus on any device that you can't run an agent on, a device that is not sending logs up to a SIM. Those are great candidates for us, and we focus on remediation. And as a part of that, we also have a discovery engine that discovers the devices, assesses them for their current state of risk, and then enables our operators or users to go out and fix them and then monitor them. So that's what we do.
I think most people are comfortable with the Internet of Things. They get the idea of their toothbrush can connect and so forth. But this idea of operational technology, OT technologies, connecting, for someone who is unclear about IoT versus OT, how does Sonu explain the difference?
When you think of operational technology, you're thinking about devices in general that have the ability to affect change in the physical environment. And it could either be that these devices can affect change in the physical environment, or changes in the physical environment affect the way that device is potentially sending data upstream. And this is where I think from the perspective of industrial settings, especially, the distinction is important, because when we think of industrial devices in general, the understanding is that when you think about an industrial device, you're talking a PLC or a SCADA device. However, industrial printers, for example, these are devices that generally people don't think of as, well, it's a printer. How critical could it be? It's not really a PLC. It's not really, bringing down a printer. How bad could that be? But if you think about the printer as an operational technology device, in the context of a manufacturing setting, for example, product is getting off of the assembly line and it is getting packaged, but that package requires a label slapped on it before it can get to the next phase of the value chain of the supply chain. Now, if the industrial printer footprint is taken out, you are essentially crippling that supply chain right at the start, right at that assembly line, just off of the assembly line. These printers appear along that entire supply chain as well. It could be the next distribution warehouse. You have new industrial printers sitting there for applying new tags and labels to that package. So for that physical equipment to go from a manufacturing assembly line all the way to a retail shelf, there are several industrial printers set up along the way. So if you think about it from that overlap, there's a bit of an overlap between, is that IoT or is that OT? It certainly appears to be a traditional IoT device because, hey, it's a printer. But at the same time, because the application here, it might be a ruggedized printer that is made for to operate in an industrial setting that has a direct impact on an industrial and manufacturing workflow, and that's really important to factor in. The other angle here, I would say, is when you think of the other, or IoT, the industrial Internet of Things, you may also have devices that are used to sense or collect data from these OT devices that are below them, to then essentially enable monitoring or contribute to decision-making around productivity, decision-making around operations, around workflows, around safety and overall industrial operations. So this could include devices like network gateways, actually. So you're essentially talking about a device that can be a protocol converter. It could facilitate connectivity to remote sites that otherwise can't connect using it could be a cellular gateway, for example. And so below those devices, you could have your traditional OT like sensors, actuators, controllers, conveyor belts, all of those. But this additional layer above that is again in that it's a little there's a bit of an overlap there, because we're talking about devices that are in that industrial setting, consuming data from those OT devices and potentially enabling communicating upstream to a control center, for example. And those devices are also, much like the industrial printer, a gateway could also contribute to disrupting and dramatically impacting operations in an industrial setting. And again, it's a gateway is not something when you poll someone, a group of people, they may not generally think of a gateway as a traditional industrial device, because again, it's not a PLC. However, these are devices that are also devices you can run an agent on. There's no EPP or EDR that you can deploy into one of these devices. They may not be sending logs up to a SIM for someone at a SOC to monitor, are these devices getting, is there unauthorized access? Are there changes being made to these devices that might put them in a position to be remotely compromised? And so I would certainly encourage your listeners to also start thinking about the mix and the diversity of devices in industrial settings that go beyond PLCs and robotic arms and into the realm that is closer to what we think of as IoT.
Cool. So there's a lot to unpack here. So let's start with the IoT discovery itself. Is Phosphorus looking at network traffic?
So actually, that's a great question. We do not depend on network traffic analysis at all. And so the way to think about it is, imagine the network scanning technologies from the 90s that over the past few decades, we've come to realize that we can apply them to this space in a plug and play fashion, especially because of the fact that they're just going to potentially disrupt devices, destroy them. These devices are going to fall apart if you hit them with an Nmap scan, for example, or one of the traditional vulnerability assessment tools. So we essentially rebuilt the active approach specifically for IoT and OT. So we don't depend on network traffic analysis at all. We essentially have an active discovery engine that is purpose-built for this space.
Phosphorus is not looking at network traffic. Then what is it doing?
So if you think of asset discovery in general, right, you have two approaches. One is you can have a passive network dependent solution, which is essentially listening to traffic and essentially listening to devices talk and make an assertion as to what those devices are based on us listening to them talking. The other approach, which is the active approach, is not just listening to traffic, but talking to the devices in their native languages, right? So the difference and the reason why this is an incredibly hard problem is, as you correctly mentioned, these devices are deployed in very diverse settings. They are also if you think about industrial environments, these devices have a lifespan of 25 to 30 years. So a lot of them are very, very old. And as such, they all speak different languages. They all have different sensitivities to traffic hitting them. So you've got to be very careful about how you talk to them. And a great analogy we like to use is imagine you're at a State Department dinner. Okay. And you're at a State Department dinner and you have a large assembly, a large gathering of individuals from every country you could imagine that has an embassy in DC, for example. And the task is, without talking to anybody, all you can do is listen in on their conversations. You've got to know everybody's name and date of birth. And from a computer science standpoint, you would essentially take forever to get those answers because you can't talk to them. All you're doing is listening. Now, on the active approach, imagine you can speak every single language of every single country represented at that State Department dinner. You can individually go to them and talk to them in their languages. Now we're dealing with a problem that is well bounded, if you will, and so that's essentially the way we discover devices. So it could be very old devices, it could be devices that are building automation control devices that are primarily running BACnet, for example, or it could be an industrial device, a PLC, or a gateway. It could be a camera or a printer or a phone. We're essentially talking to these devices the way they expect to be talked to. And that's how we discover them.
So is Phosphorus just saying hello in 190 different languages?
We're saying hello and how are you doing? How do you feel today? All of those questions. And that's actually an interesting distinction here as well, because when you think about the next step in the journey beyond discovery, right? So let's say within an environment, you have essentially enumerated the full set of assets that are present in that environment. The next step would be, well, now that I know what's in my environment, let me go out and find out what's wrong with the things in my environment. So some of them may be running with a default password, which is very likely the case in this attack surface aspect, if you will. Some of them are running really old firmware, so outdated firmware. Some of them are certainly running firmware that has known vulnerabilities, in many cases, critical remote code execution vulnerabilities. Some of our end of life are discontinued. Some of them have serious configuration issues, which could be general configuration issues such as, hey, this device is running a remote service that it shouldn't be running, or it could be a configuration issue that maps specifically to that device family, right? To that manufacturer, to that model, to that device type. So the next phase of being able to, the value from talking to these devices directly is that not only do you know exactly what they are with a this is a full confidence, it's either 100% they are what they are because these devices don't lie. So that's a good advantage. When you talk to them and they respond, you know that they are what they are. And also you get to ask them questions about what's wrong with them. And this is where the perspective of overall risk assessment, if you will, a significant advantage over a traditional legacy, primarily passive approach is that because you're not just listening, because you're able to talk to them with an incredible amount of precision and depth, you're able to know what the current state of risk is with those devices.
So Phosphorus has done the discovery, it's established a dialogue, and it finds out that the device is running outdated pieces of firmware, that the device itself doesn't really have additional resources to update. So what are some of the mitigation options for legacy devices that's in the field and maybe hard to access?
I love that. That's a great question. And especially when you think about it from the operator standpoint, right? And in an industrial setting specifically, you might have a plant operator that is not ready to bring down a device to actually patch it. And two, in several cases, they may not even be open to any more than cosmetic changes, if you will, to their footprint because of the fact that downtime, the devices are old, they don't want to deal with the downtime, and the fact that potentially patching it might actually result in it getting destroyed because of the fact that it may not be compatible. So in such cases, what we typically see is, and certainly recommend, is to truly understand the threat model around that device. Not every, there may be vulnerabilities out there for that map to that firmware, but that does not necessarily mean you need to immediately go stop what you're doing and patch it. Truly understand the threat model, truly understand the impact of compromise, truly understand the exploitability, if you will, of that vulnerability. And before you get to patching, there may be a lot of mitigating compromise, compensating controls that you might apply to address the threat of that vulnerability. And this could mean, for example, again, depending on, this changes from one device to another. It changes based on where the operator is, what the function that device serves in that environment is. But it could mean going out and changing certain settings on that device to dramatically increase the cost of a successful attack using that vulnerability, for example. So absolutely, it may not be that patching is the only approach you have there. There will be a lot of compensating controls between, patching and, well, essentially taking the device offline entirely so as to not impact downtime, but actually making changes to the configuration on that device that dramatically increases the cost of a threat actor compromising it.
I tend to think of OT as being kind of dumb. Either I'm on, or it's off. I'm hot, or maybe I'm cold. Well, as Sonu points out, there are actually some very smart devices out there today.
Yeah, so the age of these devices, so some of these devices are from a lifespan standpoint, right? If you think of a traditional IT workstation, a lifespan is like 3 to 5 years ish, right? Like that's kind of, when we think of a lifespan of an IT device, it's kind of in that 3 to 5 year window. Whereas in an industrial setting, the traditional, what we call industrial devices, again, these are devices that worked without the internet for a while, potentially, until recently, right? Until the last couple of decades, maybe the last 10 years. So a lot of them absolutely are from a different time. And they may not be, their lifespans are in that 25 to 30 year window. So they're not always going to be candidates for replacement. However, devices like industrial printers, devices like gateways, there may be devices like machine vision systems. You could have devices that are truly bridging the cyber and physical realms, digital and physical realms. These are relatively newer devices, and as you correctly mentioned, they may have more compute. They're more resourced in many cases. they are actually over-resourced. In that, if another way I like to think about it is the sum total of the slack residual compute in all of these devices might actually be orders of magnitude, absolutely is orders of magnitude greater than the combination of AWS, GCP, and Azure compute together. And so you've got newer devices that are that have a lot of compute and resources, and you absolutely have older devices that need to be treated with more sensitivity, more delicately, because they've been around for a long time.
So turning it around and looking at the main threats that are out there, we're talking about SCADA systems, for example.
I think going back to our like that device diversity issue, in some cases, and in fact, in many cases, especially in industrial manufacturing settings, these devices are intentionally set up with default passwords because operators want to be able to log in and make changes in the event of an operational issue that arises. So as strange as it may sound, it is intentional for them to run with default passwords. Now, the other issue here is a lot of these devices don't have, they won't lock you out if you punch in the wrong password, which again, in a moment of panic, maybe an operator may be punching in a wrong character, and you don't want that operator to get locked out. Okay, so one, they're running with default passwords. Two, they don't have lockout mechanisms. What does that mean from a threat standpoint? From a threat standpoint, it means, one, in the few cases where they are not running default passwords, it is going to be trivial to launch a brute force attack because these passwords, you're not going to get locked out. You can essentially indefinitely attempt passwords until you get to the right one. In cases where they're running with default passwords, you could essentially Google a device manufacturer and you will likely see the default password listed on a data sheet, right? So from a threat standpoint, yes, some of these devices may be hard to get to. Some devices, many devices aren't, like we just talked about the diversity of these devices. However, the common theme is they are more likely than not to be running with default passwords. Now, the problem with that is if you have a device running with a default password, you don't even really need a sophisticated, exploit to pwn that device. So while there may be several vulnerabilities, known and unknown, if it's running with a default password, then that essentially becomes the path of least resistance for a threat actor to completely own and compromise and potentially repurpose that device. Again, depending on the objective of their attack. And I think that is from a threat standpoint, it's an incredibly trivial vector. And it, from the device standpoint, it doesn't even need to be a device that is buried deep down at level 0, level 1 of the Purdue model. It could be some of the gateways or the industrial printers even.
It's important to note that there's a Purdue model that establishes different layers before you can actually get to the device itself. These can be both physical and logical layers.
Those are devices that are very likely also going to be set up with default passwords. And going back to our supply chain example, if you have a footprint with thousands of these printers and they're all set up with default passwords, a trivial ransomware vector becomes, as a threat actor, I'm going to come in, I'm going to change the passwords to all of these devices. I'm going to keep the operators locked out. And that essentially becomes your ransomware campaign. And when you look at the objective of the attacker here, you could have data exfiltration is certainly an objective. Disruption and destruction is certainly an objective. Extortion, which we just talked about in terms of ransomware, is certainly an objective that can be accomplished with these devices. espionage, and persistence. Again, nobody's watching these devices, right? Their logs are not necessarily going up to a SIM. There's no agent running on these devices, and they are incredibly attractive targets because of that reason. And the other second order effect of what I just said here is, because nobody's watching them, and because the state of the market primarily is dependent on network traffic analysis today, the reality is that we don't really know how many of these devices have already been compromised. And so there is and again, if you look at a traditional environment, if you pick any large enterprise environment, if I was a CISO, let's say I'm going to buy everything that's market leader for endpoint, for cloud, for email, for identity and authentication, every aspect of the attack surface, I'm going to go with the best of breed I have. But from a depth of security standpoint, because there hasn't been until recently approaches that are actively going to the devices and grabbing state from the devices, there isn't a lot of knowledge out there around what is actually the state of these devices out there.
So again, with this device that's nested, for example, buried deep, what Sonu is describing is that you could have a chain attack where, a router allows you to pivot to some other device, which allows you to pivot to some other device, and ultimately resulting in the device that you're trying to target.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what the objective of the attack is, right? So if, what we're noticing is the existing status quo today with industrial manufacturing environments, specifically from a security standpoint, is the focus is on a small subset of those devices. The focus is on, again, let's talk about the PLCs, right? But if your objective is holding an operation for ransom, or to cause serious destruction and damage, the reality is that you may not even need to get down to those level of devices. You essentially could manipulate, degrade, or disrupt a set of gateways in that environment, which could ultimately have the same effect. And so what I would say is the diversity of these devices is a major challenge that needs more awareness on.
Sonu mentioned that we might not know of these attacks. We're not really looking or listening or understanding them. I'm curious, is there something he can actually demonstratively point to as an OT attack?
Well, the hard thing with that is when you think of data exfil as an example, or even persistence as an example, data exfil, you could make the argument that, well, if I have an intelligent enough, behavioral network behavior anomaly detection, maybe you might catch it, right? Maybe even if it's a very sophisticated actor that is trying to hide the traffic around normal traffic, you might still be able to get to it. But because this attack surface aspect is for the most part unmonitored at the asset level, it's impossible to answer that question. And so especially because of the fact that active attacks, we may not know about them until we actually go look at the devices. And the other part I would say is, in general, with the threat landscape, we talk a lot about the threat landscape is evolving. It's always evolving, right? And that's a constant in our industry. Longer term, as organizations reinforce security controls around all other aspects of the attack surface, like we just talked about, with whether it be email or endpoint or cloud or other identity, when this remains unmonitored at the asset level, this aspect of the attack surface is going to continue to be more targeted. It is going to be more attractive to a threat actor especially because of the fact that of everything we've just talked about. So as for what those attacks might look like, this is an aspect of the attack surface that I feel you could launch a successful attack with either one of the objectives we've discussed.
So obviously Stuxnet being the most classic example of an OT attack. That was the type of mind-blowing at the time, at least to me, something like hasn't really occurred since then. So there's not really something that we can point to per se.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you think of going back to the non-OT parts of we didn't talk much about cameras, right? But if you think of the quiet exit campaign, the quiet exit was, I'm actually looking it up right now. That was from May 22.
Quiet exit is a malware identified by Mandiant in early 2022. And it is known for attacking security cameras, much like Mirai. However, unlike Mirai, Quiet Exit went after intelligence, specifically targeting email.
If you look into Quiet Exit, the initial vector there was infected cameras, right? And infected cameras where how the initial point of compromise was, and this same model we've seen recently with some of the Chinese activity in the South Pacific as well. There may be internet exposed appliances that are again running with several critical vulnerabilities, or you might have cameras. We don't even need to go talk about Mirai and a DDoS here. These same campaigns could apply more for targeted campaigns as opposed to just a spray and pray. Let me gather every camera out there with a default password and use that for a targeted DDoS attack. These devices are certainly great candidates for initial compromise steps for campaigns coming up active and coming up in the future. So more recently, I would say Quiet Exit is certainly one example we can pull up.
Part of the problem is that we don't really hear enough about the OT attack surface itself. That awareness seems to be missing, and at a critical time.
So I want to say when we think of the big part of what we've covered so far is network analysis is kind of the status quo, right? Like that, and understandably so, because again, operators have lived through a couple decades of seeing active scans bring down their manufacturing plants, and as such have been conditioned to not ever do it again. So I think one major development overall in the industry is the fact that we have now started seriously looking into active approaches that are purpose-built for these devices. And I think that is certainly something we need more awareness on overall, because of the fact that you get a lot more depth of information from an active approach. Other than that, I think we talked about the fact that in many cases patching may not be a reality just because of the nature of the devices we're talking about, and the role they play in the overall manufacturing operation. And that is also where I would say if there's one suggestion I would have is starting small with what you can practically bite off of early. So make it harder make a successful compromise harder. And this is where passwords, it sounds like fairly rudimentary, but again, because of how these devices are set up and how operators tend to get into them and the other daisy chain set of devices around them, organizational changes may also be necessary to actually operationalize getting to a state where you can have strong passwords on these devices. So I think that is another piece where it would be good to talk about asset ownership, right? Even without going into deep OT, even in traditional IT, traditional enterprise environments, you may not have a real owner for a device, meaning until that device stops working, IT may not even know about it. But it stops working, someone complains, and then IT hears about it. Then they send someone over to take a look at it. And even then, they're not about to go in and update firmware to the latest version or change passwords on it or update configurations on it. They're incentivized to essentially get it back up and operational and move on. So I think another topic here that's worth exploring is organizational change. What truly needs to happen organizationally from an IT standpoint, from a security standpoint, from a building and facilities management standpoint, from a physical security standpoint. We are at a point where I think more conversation and more awareness needs to be put on what that means for organizations.
So in the scans that Phosphorus has done thus far, what is often, oh, I didn't know moment for some of the clients? What are the device types or types of situations they find themselves in?
Okay, so I love this question. So what we've noticed, again, this is traditional large enterprise, right? We're talking Fortune 50. It could be a mix of financial services, manufacturing, healthcare, oil and gas, utilities. What we're seeing is 50 to 80% of their entire IoT OT footprint running with default passwords. About 25 to 30% running with critical CVEs. About 25% is end of life or discontinued. In some cases, around 30 to 35% is actually unknown. And this is the interesting angle of decentralized procurement, meaning not every connected device purchase has a central authority approving it. Not every connected device purchase has an established workflow around why are we buying this device, who's going to operate it, who's going to maintain it, what happens when we need to get it replaced, what happens if it stops working. These questions don't have a central structured approach to contribute to the decision making. So what this ends up meaning is we may have some devices that have asset owners. Some the organization may have plans to get owners for those devices. And some, they don't have owners and they don't have plans to get owners either because they never really knew they had to. And so I want to say just between the configuration issues, the password state, the firmware issues, and the lack of ownership and the overall product lifecycle as in its end of life to discontinued, that is a common theme. It doesn't matter how resourced the organization is. It could be a Fortune 25, Fortune 10 environment. We're going to see that across the board.
It's really hard to get enterprises just even enforce good password hygiene. Even harder to start thinking about devices that are under your control as well.
Yeah, I mean, the way the market, I would say, is divided today is to your earlier question, in many cases, until something really bad happens, people aren't there. That's just the nature of how some of these markets are, who we are as human beings. I think just from we need to really be inspired and motivated to act. You either need, and in the lack of a true regulatory requirement, a regulatory push around, thou shalt not have default passwords in your environments, right? There is no such requirement today. And until, so there's no regulatory push, there isn't we know it's coming, but there hasn't been a WannaCry not Petya moment for IoT OT yet in North America specifically. And so in the absence of a regulatory push, in the absence of something terrible happening for people to truly get inspired and motivated to act, again, human nature, what remains is the security leaders out there who are truly being proactive about it, who see this, who have the vision to understand that this is the least secure aspect of my attack surface. And as such, I need to be proactive about it. That's where we're seeing interest, right? And that's where we're seeing a lot, especially if you go outside the traditional. So far, when you think IoT, when you think OT security, it's primarily the industrial sectors that have that have started deploying, that have been deploying network traffic analysis tools. But the rest of the footprint, all of those connected devices that are, again, they're not running agents, they're not sending logs up to anybody. The CISOs and the CIOs who see that coming and proactively want to act are the ones that are driving adoption today.
Then again, there's something like the Biden-Harris Cybersecurity National Strategy. That should help. For the first time, it really calls out OT technology.
It certainly is a step in the right direction. It is the one step of the journey. It certainly helped drive awareness around it. I think it had a whole separate section in the document, which was great. But there a lot of work remains to be done, and individuals such as yourself bringing more awareness to the problem as well. I think we need to be a lot more proactive about it, because this is one of those areas where just from the asymmetry of the attack sophistication, the sophistication required of a threat actor to actually influence dramatically outsized impact on operations, it is the widest. It is the sharpest. So I think that is a big part of why we need more awareness. And again, because of the way operations are set up today, again, going back to the industrial manufacturing environments, we can't just go to them and say, patch your PLCs now. It's not going to happen. And that's where I think it's got to be a combination of truly establishing a security journey, if you will, getting them on the path to a point where their entire footprint is the most stable and secure it could be, and in parallel, driving change on the organizational front.
I'd like to thank Sonu Shankar from Phosphorus for talking about the need for more OT security. The idea that some of these devices that we have out in the field have more compute power today than ever before, perhaps as much as the cloud, well, that's got to get people's attention, right? Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. DM me at robertvamosi@infosec.exchange on Mastodon and tell me what you like and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up, including one on railroad security and more on quantum computing, and of course, more OT and IT related topics. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.